This is a nice report from the World Resources Institute. We have talked about behavioral shifts and choices people can make. We have also talked about something interesting, that this idea of doing individual carbon footprints and trying to track them. I'm a big fan of it, but the history of it is that the oil companies got together and decided to use it as a trick on people to say you are also part of the problem and not just us. It's a cute thing, but anyway, if it has a good impact overall, it's okay. On the other hand, there is another aspect where if you start focusing too much on feeling guilty and trying very hard to do something on your own, you may lose sight of the fact that the system is a carbon trap, and we have to change the system, make it decarbonized, and so on. So keeping all that in mind, what is it that the behavioral shifts can actually do in terms of the impacts on emissions? This report tries to compute that. So the effective impact, we'll see what we mean by effective impact. The effective impact of behavioral shifts in energy, transport, and food, they always come up, renewable energy, but also how much you waste, and how much you drive, how much you fly, and of course how much food you waste, and whether you reduce meat consumption, and so on. Global quantitative synthesis of the greenhouse gas emission reduction potential of behavioral changes in the transportation, energy, and food sectors is the agenda here. I will obviously be brief. It's a nice, very long report with lots of computations, projections, and calculations based on data and region-specific as well as global numbers. And we'll try to just hit the most salient points, which means I'm making the choice for you, so you need to read the report if you want more details. It is a very nice report available online. What are the highlights? Meeting global climate targets requires widespread shifts in human behavior. Research to date has emphasized individual level behavior change. Again, keep in mind that this is important also to feel agency, feel engaged in the action, but the system has to change as well. To quantify the achievable emissions reductions through individual behavior change, this study combines research on the projected emissions impact of key behaviors with data on the feasibility of changing those behaviors through behavioral intervention. So it's one thing to say behavioral changes can make an impact, but how do you incentivize behavioral change and get over typical biases human minds have, like buying a hybrid and not paying attention to anything else, or riding a bicycle and not paying attention to how much meat you're consuming, and so on and so forth. Behavioral interventions demonstrate modest but consistent success, increasing target behaviors by 10 percentage points compared to control groups. So you take a group that has not been incentivized to change behavior, and you have a group that does, and then you see the difference. Intervention design matters. Analysis of intervention methods reveals that choice architecture and commitment devices are the best and most impactful tools, while information-based approaches such as carbon footprint calculators are among the least. So you may feel good about tracking carbon footprint, but if it doesn't give you better tools on how to change, give you options to commit to your behavioral shifts and sustain them. Well, combined behavioral changes could theoretically offset all the average global citizens per capita emissions. Real-world individual-level interventions typically achieve only 10% of that, highlighting the need for both individual actions and systemic supports to support you to stay engaged with your action plan, but also the system itself. If you want to drive less and you don't have any option in terms of public transportation or safe biking lanes, then you are going to fail, right? So that's where the system comes in. 4 priority shifts emerge as high impact behaviors: reducing gas-powered vehicle use, decreasing air travel, lowering residential fossil fuel consumption, and reducing animal product consumption. Because we are focusing on energy, transport, and food, these are the ones, but there are many other sectors that we can be working on as well. The impact difference between behaviors is massive. Eliminating car use reduces emissions 78 times more effectively than composting, for example. So if you are doing composting and feeling good about yourself and not paying attention to your car driving, then obviously you are missing some low-hanging fruit in terms of actually reducing your impacts. Realizing the emissions reduction possible will require focusing on priority shifts, effective tools and policy, and industry support. So let's jump to executive summary. Background: achieving necessary greenhouse gas emissions reductions to avoid the most destructive effects of climate change depends on shifting behaviors. And then you need to worry about how to make that happen. Systems and individual level actions are needed to unlock the full potential of behavior change. As you can see, I'm jumping the text here. You can go and read it. Global emissions are deeply unequal. High emitters have an ethical and practical responsibility to change the behaviors that drive global emissions. Now you are asking for two things. One, you must reduce your emissions, and you should be mindful that you are emitting much more than somebody else. That becomes a little bit of an issue for many people. You can easily say, no, the population is high in India and China, and it doesn't matter what I do. So you can get into a narrative that becomes rational ignorance, or basically wait and find kind of inaction pathways. Key findings of the report: behavioral interventions show consistent but modest effects, typically improving target behaviors by 10 percentage points compared to controls. We identify 4 priority shifts that we already mentioned: decreasing gas-powered car use, decreasing air travel, decreasing home fossil fuel use through structural changes such as solar adoption and comprehensive renovations. There are details everywhere. If you want to do renovations, then retrofitting, then you have to be really rich to do that. Plus, you have to have a cost-benefit analysis to say that retrofitting will eventually recover the costs and save you money in the long run. Decreasing consumption of animal-based proteins. So how much decrease is needed? How much can you really do? What if you really love meat and can do other things to offset your meat consumption? So you always have a portfolio approach that can work better. On the other hand, some common green behaviors like composting, while valuable, have a minimal effect on emissions. We refer to these remaining shifts as supplementary shifts, but you have to be careful because the externalities of composting co-benefits can be much greater in terms of reducing pollution and methane emission, or that's accounted in the emissions. But water pollution, air pollution, just aesthetics, well-being, etc. can be factors as well. Other food behaviors, including decreasing food waste and the consumption of packaged or processed food, and composting, can be good for health anyway, as well as the environment. Decreasing home energy use, superficial, so including shifting to improved cooking equipment and to more efficient appliances, and decreasing home energy use. So part of the mitigation solution is not only renewables but also electrification and efficiencies, but you have to always make sure that you don't use buying an efficient dishwasher as your contribution, because that has very little overall impact. Transitioning away from gas-powered cars is critical, especially in terms of the lock-in. So if you build more factories or train more workers to build internal combustion engines, then it will be hard to get out of that system for a while. So you have to quickly start decommissioning the existing ICE engine cars. Our novel effective analysis demonstrates a significant gap between theoretical potential and real-world achievement. We'll look at a formula to say how we can actually compute effective impact as opposed to just counting the number of people who have made some behavioral shifts. Okay, so there are numbers here that we'll come back to. Prioritization is key. So the difference in emissions impact between behaviors is massive, and shifts toward high impact behaviors dwarf the adoption of lower impact actions. For example, living car free is 78 times more impactful than composting. So I don't compost because I don't cook myself. I eat in a dining hall, and they do something as a part of the institutional action. But reducing waste is still important. But I live car free. I only take Uber or go with friends when I need to. So does that give me any extra credits? Well, for now, yes. Recommendations then: behavioral interventions should reflect geographic and economic realities. It's not a one size fits all. As we said, rich people have to reduce their emissions, and poor people should be allowed to come up in consumption, increase in carbon footprints to reach certain human development index, even as we keep an eye on the overall environmental impact somehow. Policymakers should focus on specific priority shifts rather than dispersing effects across lower impact behaviors. There is a lawnmower guy going around here. Hopefully it's not screwing up my recording, but I will check to make sure. In transports, policy should aim to shift away from gas-powered cars. Investments in public and electric transport infrastructure and targeted incentives like e-bike subsidies and enhanced public transit access can reshape the choice environment and support the shift away from gas-powered cars. These are obvious, intuitive, and yet we have to make sure that they are followed up and are made part of the options for people who want to make behavioral shifts. If I want to give up a car and live, then there should be options like ride hailing, which is not as as good for the environment as public transportation, but last mile issues, where do I have to go to catch the train or the bus and so on, right? So energy sector interventions also include various things like solar and decrease baseline energy use and always reduce energy waste, right? But you can also have price incentives that make solar home and energy efficient renovations more affordable. So you can actually subsidize people's renovations to reduce their overall energy consumption, including the home energy use. In the food sector, choice architecture emerges as a powerful tool. Making plant-based meals the default option in institutional settings has demonstrated significant impact without reducing satisfaction. So if you are a meat eater, but if you get some plant-based alternative that satisfies you and your taste buds, then maybe you will go along and help the environment and global warming. Across behaviors, policy should aim to use the most effective behavioral tools, particularly choice architecture and commitment devices, while de-emphasizing information initiatives which show less impact. Researchers should expand geographic and sectoral scope of behavioral change studies. So we'll see that there is a big gap in the potential and actual data collection on behavioral shift impacts. Industry leaders should align sustainability initiatives with priority shifts, so they also need to identify where their unique market position can drive meaningful change and help customers and employees make sustainable changes. So it's employers can do a lot to make the employees also be conscious about their role in terms of behavioral shifts. Individuals can maximize their climate impact in two ways: by personally changing key behaviors and collectively pushing for better policies and industry practices that make sustainable options more available and affordable. This is always important. We should not lose sight of the fact that system has to do a lot for us as well, not only to help with our behavioral shifts, but to actually move the system towards decarbonization as a whole. Let's jump ahead and look at a couple of key concepts. One of them is called bounded rationality. It's a foundational concept. It's the idea that people have limited rather than perfect rationality when making decisions. That is bounded rationality. As a result, we lean on cognitive biases or mental shortcuts to manage a complex world. It can be confirmation bias, or it can be negativity bias, and so on, where we seek, truths that already confirm our preconceived notions or beliefs rather than being objective about what is being presented in reality. Several cognitive biases are particularly relevant to climate action. Complexity avoidance, you know what that is. Nobody wants to make decisions when things just appear too complex and uncertain or maybe even ambiguous. Present bias, so we prioritize immediate gains over future benefits, which always happens. Social influence, our choices are shaped by those around us, so in this sense peer pressure is supposed to work, is known to work, so behavioral shifts can be a cultural meme if enough people begin to shift. If a community begins to move towards composting, driving less, and not wasting food, etc., then everybody wants to fit in and not appear as being out of step with the community in which they live. Definitions of behavior shift then, a broad category of behaviors that specifies the type of change required to achieve a larger outcome, such as lower greenhouse gas emissions. Examples of behavior shifts include less air travel, gas-powered car use, meat consumption, and so on. Behavioral interventions, initiatives designed to change a behavior or pattern of behavior, basically modifying utility bills to show households how their energy use compares to other people or their peers. It's kind of an intervention where you are not trying to shame people, but you're trying to tell them, look, your friends are all doing this, so maybe you want to join them as well. Behavioral tool then, a specific psychological or strategic method used to influence people's behaviors. For example, an intervention offering coveted parking spots for those who carpool is using incentives as a tool. It's carpool lanes, carpool parking spots, and carpooling incentives in an office can all be very useful. Visualizing the effective impact of calculation then, greenhouse gas impact, of course, data are extracted on the projected emissions impact of key behaviors in energy, transport, and food. Times effective change, data are extracted on individual level experiments that aimed to change those same behaviors. Those data are multiplied by the projected impact, and that gives you the such effective change, and this is effective impact. Multiplication of greenhouse gas impact, which is what we are aiming at in terms of overall reduction of emissions by behavioral shifts, and then we are looking for effective change, which is defined here, and then that gives us effective impact. The result is the effective impact reflecting projected emissions times the demonstrated feasibility or effectiveness of the changing behavior in the real world. So just because people changed behavior, it doesn't necessarily translate to impact unless the change is effective, and feasible is effectiveness as well, feasibility. 6 major categories of behavioral tools used in the intervention literature. So it's a meta-analysis. That's why they say research is needed in some places for tracking behavioral impacts and shifts. Feedback, so smart meters kind of things. Incentives and disincentives, like green rewards programs, can be financial rewards or discounts, and non-monetary rewards could be a recognition, and commitments such as public pledges with goals, implementation, and intentions. Social norms, so energy bills comparing usage to neighbors that we mentioned to incentivize behavior change. Choice architecture, so appliances set to energy savings such as defaults, framing and priming, and simplified processes. And enhanced information such as eco-labels, being sure that we are avoiding greenwashing, where companies just lie and put fake eco-labels or misleading eco-labels. So they should be clear, accessible information with instructions and actionable information. Okay. I'm not trying to rush it, but it's a nice report. You have to read it. I'm just being very brief. Behavioral tools, definitions, interventions, and impacts. I'm not going to read all of them, but tools, of course, include making information intuitive, accessible, providing timely feedbacks and reminders, incentives and disincentives, change the choice of architecture, so setting proper defaults and so on, communicate a social norm, obtain a commitment, and Okay, so I fit into one page. Definitions are there, so make information intuitive and accessible, presenting sustainability information in clear, accessible ways. Obvious. In intervention example, use of eco labels like Energy Star labels have been used to reduce energy use, and the results vary by appliances with potential energy savings ranging from 0 to 23% across different products. So there are such details here. Let's jump and read about obtain a commitment as a behavioral tool. Commitments can increase follow through. People commit and they feel obliged to do, follow through. When public commitments leverage visibility, when the commitments are public, commitments leverage visibility to make the commitment even stronger. Even non-binding pledges are effective due to the psychological impact of public declarations. If you stand up in public and say, I'm going to do this, then you will likely follow up. A German study encouraged car users to make a commitment. I commit to use public transportation at least once or twice in the week, next 2 weeks, in the next 2 weeks for my regular trip, and results, the commitment was effective in shifting to public transportation. The most effective vision commitment plus offering one free train or bus ticket. This is an example of a multi-intervention. So people may just get hooked to public transportation once they realize that it's quite convenient, reduces headaches of traffic jams, and so on and so forth. So let's look at some numbers. Global emissions inequality by income group. You know how all population, so this is tons of CO2 equivalent per person per year. Full population, bottom 50% are only consuming about 1.6 tons of CO2 equivalent per person. Middle income jumps to 6.6. Top 10% are consuming 31 tons CO2 equivalent per year, and the top 1% are at 110 tons of CO2 equivalent per person. Per capita emissions in India and France by income groups, again similar. There is a full population number and the top 10% number. This is important because when you say India's per capita CO2 emission is only 3 tons per person, very misleading because there are very large ranges at which people are consuming. So these are, as high as some of the rich countries, and similarly in France. They're not surprising at all, except the numbers here. It's 8 tons CO2 equivalent per year for the top 10%, whereas here it's 25 tons CO2 equivalent, which is expected because if you go to the US, it's even higher. Behavioral shifts categorization in this working paper. Transportation, decrease air travel, decrease gas-powered car use, and of course shifting behaviors, specific behaviors include decreasing air travel, shifting to being car free, and so on. Energy, decrease home fossil fuel use and decrease home energy demand. So this is superficial, whereas this is a structural change. But it has to be possible, because how do you reduce your fossil fuel use unless the energy supply coming to you is renewable energy, and you may not always have a choice on it. Even if you have a choice on it, your homes owners society or whatever association may not allow you to put up solar panels wherever you want, or windmills for sure, because the property prices can go down, windmills look ugly, make noise, and so on and so forth. In food, decrease consumption of animal-based protein and other food behaviors like decreasing food waste and packaged and processed goods, and increasing composting, and so on. Regional behavioral impact research and emissions mismatch of the top 10 highest emitting country. Basically that means the global emission share is relatively large for China, India, and of course the share of behavioral research impact is very low, only 10.5% for China and 2.2% for India, and 0% for Russia, Brazil, Indonesia, Iran, and South Korea, which is very surprising, even though it's a small country with small contributions to emissions. If you have rich countries, US, there is a much better alignment of research of behavioral shifts on emissions, and there is a research surplus in European Union and Japan. It just gives you sense that there are some countries which are worrying about behavioral shifts, which means they must be also thinking about incentivizing it or already incentivizing it for reducing overall emissions. Projected emissions reductions of behavioral shifts in energy, transport and food. I won't read the details, but priority shifts as decreasing gas-powered car use, active in public transportation, EVs and hybrid vehicles, and living car-free, etc., decreasing air travel. So you are looking at transportation, energy, and food. So in energy, you have more efficient home energy use or more efficient home and renewable home energy use. I'm not being very detailed because basically there are numbers associated with the projections they made in terms of these sectoral reductions with behavioral shifts in energy, transport and food. So it's a real calculation. Of course, projections are always based on assumptions, and if you do it correctly, then they can come true. Okay, so there are supplementary shifts such as energy reductions and efficient appliances and reducing food waste. They are important, but there are bigger items that you can focus on, especially because one action bias means you will reduce waste but not worry about consumption itself. Behavioral changes in extreme versus moderate scenarios. So vegan, renewable home energy and car free are extreme behaviors, whereas moderate behaviors, EV or hybrid, home energy renovations and less meat. So there are also country level projections made. I won't go into the details, but you understand how the World Resources Institute WRI has done this. Projected emissions reduction estimates from behavioral shifts in transport. So everything adds up. You go towards less impactful actions here like telecommuting and low emission driving practices such as carpooling, whereas if you live car free, it is much more impactful in terms of projected reduction in tons of CO2 equivalent per capita per year. Projected emissions reductions in energy, renewable home energy is a high impact one. Efficient appliances are quite low impact, even though they should be part of the overall behavior. In terms of behavior in food, veganism is of course high impact, but composting is not. On the other hand, it's not always easy for people to just shift to being vegetarian or vegans and so on. There is an action agenda for industry which is basically to align their sustainability initiatives with evidence-based priority shifts and incentivizing employees and providing employees the tools to make the shifts with metro cards, parking spots for carpooling or paying for high occupancy lane use and so on, and or even telecommuting, even though it's a less impactful action overall. So by focusing on what works rather than what is easier to implement, companies can drive meaningful emissions reductions while creating sustainable business value. Okay, areas of future research then. Bridge global research gaps, so identify and quantify the benefits of sustainable behaviors. Increase intervention research on specific behaviors like air travel and home solar and tools. I have discussed elsewhere the impact of air travel. It's obviously growing. It's still overall about 2% or so of the total emissions, but per capita it can really take up a large fraction of your, let's say, portfolio if you fly. But it's very interesting to fly, to see nice places, cultural exchanges, employment for people in the tourism industry or airlines and so on. So we should also be thinking about making aviation fuels carbon neutral or bioenergy. There are ideas coming up for flying with the batteries and so on and so forth, right? So systems frame interventions. While this analysis quantifies GHG, greenhouse gas impacts of individual level behavior shifts and interventions, future rigorous impact studies should be designed to specifically investigate the impact of systems level interventions like federal solar subsidies, congestion pricing schemes, increasing EV charging infrastructure, which is very critical to deal with range anxiety, and of course eco labels, which again has to be monitored to avoid greenwashing. And these are very useful in terms of their potential impacts on behavior change, corresponding emissions reductions, and broader socioeconomic benefits and co-benefits. So let's close it out with some words on conclusion. While interventions aimed at changing individual behavior can meaningfully reduce emissions, they achieve only about 10% of their total potential impact without systemic support. This dramatic gap between what's theoretically possible and what's actually achievable underscores that individual level interventions alone cannot deliver the transformative change needed. So systemic changes are very critical and carry 90% of the load. The path forward demands strategic focus on integration rather than dispersing efforts across many small actions. Focusing on high impact priority shifts will drive exponentially greater reductions. For individuals, this means a dual strategy, adopting these key high-impact behaviors while pushing for policies and business practices that make sustainable choices more accessible and affordable. The more things you try to do, the less will you be able to keep up, because willpower is a limited resource and there is these boundary effects on choices, rationality, bounded rationality, which begins to affect, every day you cannot wake up and start tracking everything, but a couple of big items can be much easier to do and track. For policy and industry leaders, the evidence points to a path forward. When individual actions align with the supportive policies and industrial practices, both personal and institutional changes can reinforce each other. This coordinated approach represents the most valuable pathway toward meeting critical climate targets. Okay, so sorry for being brief and rushing it a little bit. It's about 30 minutes, which is good in terms of a summary of a big report, and you can go back and read the report should you want more details. Okay, very nice. See you in the next topic.